Hi, Kleutgen.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Doing pretty well.
Good. All right. We'll just wait for Josh to jump on, and then we can begin.
Sure.
Is he here? Let me see. He's not in yet.
He said it's not
Fashionably late.
available.
It's not available.
Yeah, you had a chat.
Oh, here he is.
Let's go.
All right.
Good evening, gentlemen. How's my audio coming through?
Sounds good.
Oh, thank God. Yeah, it said it was unavailable at first. I had to restart Twitter, so I guess that was just some weird quirk on my end.
No problem.
So, should we get this started?
Let's do it.
Okay, so you'll have to excuse me because I have no idea how to pronounce your username. Would you mind just giving that to me once?
Kleutgen.
Oh, I meant the other guy. So, Kleutgen, you said? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so I assume that Kleutgen, you'll be taking the pro-abortion position?
Interesting. But no. I'll be taking the pro-life position.
Right. Okay. In all seriousness, Kleutgen will be advocating for pro-life, and Richard will be taking the pro-choice position. And let's hear from Kleutgen first. I'd like maybe set some quick ground rules. I don't want to sit with a stopwatch in front of me, so obviously this should be a fun conversation. But do try to keep it to one tangent at a time, just so there's not a lot of crossfire going back and forth. And I don't want to have a. I didn't watch all of it, but I'd prefer this doesn't degenerate into that Zen Shapiro debacle. So let's.
Oh, that's what
try not
that's
to-
what I want. Yeah, just full on yelling at each other. That's the Chad choice.
So
Yeah.
with that being said, Kleutgen, take the microphone.
Yeah, if I could give you content like the Zen Shapiro debate, that'd be great. Yeah, I guess. So this is directly in response to the Zen Shapiro debate. Richard said he was interested in having a debate with a pro-life advocate who was not retarded. So hopefully I can live up to that. Yeah, so I guess I'll just introduce my position. I expect that the debate will probably end up focusing on more fundamental disagreements than the issue of abortion, but I'll just introduce my position on abortion specifically, and we can see where it goes. So I'm a traditionalist Roman Catholic. I defend a strongly pro-life position. I think that abortion is categorically immoral at any stage of pregnancy and should be illegal at any stage of pregnancy. So I guess there are kind of three questions at stake. One is the value of human life. It's kind of fundamental ethical question that we can debate. Second, my concern, at what stage does life begin, or this question of fetal personality. And third are the scope and purposes of the law. I'll take a pro-life position on each of these. I think the state does have a concern with regulating and prohibiting abortion as a matter of natural justice, and that abortion is a violation of the value of human life. So I'll just leave my opening statement pretty brief, and we can see what issues end up being salient, what Richard wants to challenge. But I think that's a pretty straightforward account. Yeah, if you
Quick
have any questions,
interjection there. Just to really elucidate it. So, in your view, 100% of the time, there is no justification for abortion. In the Kleutgen state, there would not be a single abortion under any circumstance.
Correct. Except, I suppose, spontaneous, unintentional abortions, yeah, but no medical abortions, right?
Okay, I think that's very fair, and I would like to thank Kleutgen for being on. I do think this is an important subject. It's obviously a subject that generates a lot of heat, but I expect that we're actually going to develop this debate in an interesting way that will be enjoyable to the audience and hopefully enlightening to the audience. At the very least, they get to hear a debate between a LARPing trad calf Comic-Con Dungeons and Dragons enthusiast against a Biden voting, Swiss cheese eating gay fed, which, what could be better? But yeah, that being said, we're talking about this now because of the recent Texas law, which allows people of any state, to sue abortion providers, even people who helped a woman achieve an abortion. And this is bringing into question Roe v. Wade. I think there probably will be some kind of Supreme Court announcement on this coming soon, or a decision on this, rather. But what I want to look at is, and I don't mean to say this in an insulting manner, what I want to question, I think, from the outset is a kind of the level of seriousness from the pro-life side. That is, are you really willing to see this all the way through? And by the fact that you apparently aren't, does that tell us something, reveal something about what you ultimately think this act represents? So, focusing on the Texas law at the beginning, you can sue the abortion provider. You could sue an Uber driver who drove the woman to the abortion clinic. You could possibly sue the Whataburger employee of Texas. That's a great restaurant, by the way. Really greasy hamburgers, amazing. You could sue him for kind of assisting in some way for the woman to achieve this abortion, but you can't sue the woman. And it seems to indicate a certain, I don't know, maybe Victorian prudish attitude towards women, that they can't make decisions on their own. They're not men. They're kind of, I don't know, childlike beings that we shouldn't hold responsible for anything. You could say that. But I think it also reveals the fact that even the pro-life side doesn't really equate this with murder. If I were to suggest that there be a law that when a hitman is hired by someone to commit a violent act, that the hitman should only be prosecuted, but that the person who hired the hitman, well, after all, that he's the real victim. He's the hitman is profiting off his despair, and so on. I would be laughed out of court, as they say. No one would take that seriously, because clearly I don't have the courage of my own convictions. And I think we can kind of see that in the pro-life cause. Even when Donald Trump was asked about the abortion issue in 2016, he was asked, would you punish the woman for committing an abortion? And he thought about it for a moment, and he said, yes, well, I think we have to. That was an honest response. Donald Trump was attacked by all sides after he said that. After he had a moment of honesty, he was attacked by, of course, the pro-choice side, but he was also attacked by the pro-life side, in the sense that we don't do that. We don't actually want to go all the way with this. We don't actually have the courage of our convictions. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Kleutgen is like that. He seems very sincere. And I think in a Kleutgen state, all abortion would be illegal. And even the woman would have to, I don't know, go to jail, maybe be executed for engaging in an abortion. But I think we can also look to history and learn something about what people ultimately consider this act. And that this will reveal a certain reasoning that you don't see among current pro-lifers. Going back deep into the Bronze Age, maybe even to the Stone Age, you can find evidence that abortion was taking place. The fact that we have evidence at all means that it was taking place on a fairly wide scale in ancient Egypt. There's actually a recipe for a potion for abortion. The Holy Bible is largely silent on this issue. I do think that the pro-life cause does ultimately derive from the conception of man as made in the image of God in Genesis. I think that is a bedrock for what they believe. And that was a revolutionary concept that was brought into the world with Genesis. That being said, the Bible, including the Old Testament laws, are either silent on the abortion issue or ambiguous on that issue. When we look to Catholic theologians of the past, both Augustine and Thomas Aquinas are again a bit wishy-washy, you could say, on the issue of abortion. When there is a quickening, that is when a baby is moving around in the mother's womb, that is when he is ensouled, so to speak, or that's when he possesses some kind of rational capacity. So what I am fundamentally saying is that no one in human history, including the most Catholic of Catholics or Christian of Christians, have ever really equated abortion with murder. It is something else. And when I look at the pro-life position today, I see a lot of people who want to kind of solve another problem by being pro-life. So as we know, and I think Kleutgen and I agree on this, we're living in a decaying world. We're living in a degenerating world. And people are attracted to being pro-life because they think that we can just pass this piece of legislation and all of America will be inhabited by trad wives. Well, empirical evidence really does not suggest that that would be the case. And, and to be fair here, I'm talking about most people on the pro-life side. I'm not necessarily talking about Kleutgen, there's no dispute that he is a sincere person. Not only do 20% of all women who've reached the age of 30, they have had an abortion at some point. Half of women seeking abortion have already had one. So and one could also add, which is a very common pro-choice argument, that abortion will exist in some form or another. You are simply, by making it illegal, you are simply encouraging or necessitating women to seek abortion in rather dangerous and unseemly circumstances. The fact is, we have not, in all of human history, considered abortion the equivalent of murder. It might have a certain biblical foundation in Genesis, but even among Jews and Christians, it was not really considered murder. And that people who are pro-life now are kind of doing it for another reason. It's either just, whatever the liberals say, we say the opposite, or it's let's stop abortion. And all of these women who are getting abortion now would just become trad wives or something like this, and everything would be saved. I think we deal a lot in the realm of fantasy. And when we're not looking at history and understanding what that reveals about our own reason about issues like that, we can't open our mind to serious concerns, serious issues about the abortion cause. Whether this, I will certainly grant Kleutgen that abortion is a nasty act. It is by no means ideal, but that its effects really aren't that bad. It might be a kind of compromise that we don't want to talk about, that we shouldn't make a primary issue in campaigns. It is what it is, but its effects on society are not actually that bad they would be worse if it were made illegal. And in fact, there might be some benefits from allowing abortion to persist in the manner that it is. 70% of the population, though they wouldn't articulate it as in that way, basically agree with me. And I think even that number reveals something in the sense of it reveals a certain reasoning that might not be articulated as such. 50% of the voting population identifies with pro-life, yet at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, they don't want to make abortion illegal because they understand all of the consequences. So
Okay.
I won't go into more of this. I'll leave it at that. But we can talk about some of the effects of abortion later. But I think at the very beginning, I would stress my general point, which is that at the end of the day, there is no precedent for the pro-life cause in the Bible or in Christian history or in human history. And secondly, at the end of the day, pro-lifers don't ultimately have the courage of their convictions. And we can see that as revealed by their actions and by their legislation.
Okay, so I think there's a lot there to address. And Kleutgen, I want to give you, free reign to respond to whatever you thought was most salient there. I would ask if you can maybe quickly respond to two things he said in there. As regards the punishment of the woman seeking the abortion, maybe something like what you think is a just punishment, where does her moral culpability, where is that situated among all of the participants in the abortive act? I'd also like to hear you, if you have any thoughts, address the point Richard made about abortion as a political issue being a proxy for some other, desire that the conservative right might have.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I guess this is part of the reason why it might have been better to list this as a conversation rather than a debate, because I agree with Richard on a lot of points. So just to quickly address the points you brought up, as far as punishments to the woman, I mean, I think abortion is murder and that only life is commensurate with the value of life. So I think in principle, women who procure abortion should be executed. Now, the particular circumstances have to be taken into account, as in the case of any capital crimes, there can be exculpatory factors. Teenage girls who get an abortion are, morally immature and, impoverished or whatever. I'm painting a sob story to play on your heartstrings. But there are plenty of cases of women in their 30s who are middle class who procure abortions. And I think that most of the time, that's a capital offense and they should be executed. Now, I agree with Richard that abortion is also a proxy for other issues on the right. I guess this is something I was going to get into. He's basically right about the political issue that the vast majority of the American public is not pro-life in the sense that Catholic doctrine demands. Obviously, they don't share my position. There's a lot of pro-lifers who like to hold out that abortion is like the one culture war issue on which sides have remained basically static since 1973. Unlike gay marriage, whatever else, they say, 50-50, the public claims to be pro-life, pro-choice. That's extremely misleading for reasons that Richard laid out. The vast majority of the public is basically okay with Roe v. Wade. A significant minority is more strongly pro-life. They usually carve out exceptions for rape and incest. But there is, a non-trivial, 15% of the public, which is staunchly, holds my position or something approximating my position. So I think he's right. And abortion largely is a proxy for other culture war issues that conservatives just aren't able to talk about. We don't have to get into these because, Twitter TOS, but things like race, things like modern, sexual and gender politics, conservatives just feel uncomfortable addressing these issues. So, I mean, this is, again, why it's more of a conversation than a debate. I think he's basically right about most of this. So whether or not it's a good idea for, a right-wing political movement to campaign on abortion, I think is another question, because you do kind of need this red meat issue. And it is a red meat issue that I think a lot of conservative politicians, at least, don't actually care about. They can just hold this trinket out to appease their base and get them out to vote. Because there are plenty of, one-issue voter Catholic Republicans who otherwise might be swayed over to the Democratic side. who they can kind of reliably, trick into voting for whoever the GOP candidate is. So, it does benefit Republicans. And if you think that the Republican Party is a vehicle for right-wing politics, which Richard might not, I'm pretty sure Richard doesn't think that, and I'm skeptical about that too. Then maybe it makes rational sense for them to campaign on it. I don't know. Now, concerning history, this is something that was brought up in the previous debate, and I think is often an issue, especially with Protestant pro-lifers, that they'll point out that the Christianity has not taken a consistent stance on the question of abortion. It's especially clear, there's famous like Slate or Vice, or one of these left-leaning articles, magazines had an article claiming something like, abortion's a proxy for white supremacist racial politics because the Southern Baptist Convention only took a pro-life position during the Reagan administration or something to dab on single black moms or something like that. Now that might be true of the Southern Baptist Convention. I don't know enough about the Christian right coalition that emerged in the 80s, but I think that this is a bit misleading. So Richard says the Bible is silent. I mean, I'm not sure if to say it's silent on this question. It's quiet on abortion. There's not an explicit. You would have to draw out implicitly what sort of ethical teachings in the Bible actually weigh on this matter, but which I'm not going to do biblical analysis because as a good Catholic, I've read way more Aquinas than I have the Bible. But
as a good Catholic, we don't actually read that thing.
Yeah, I don't read the Bible. I went to Catholic middle school and Catholic high school. In all that time, 12 years, I read much more of the Summa than I ever touched the Bible. So,
right.
But Catholic theology on this question, I actually think is much more consistent than what Richard lays out. So it's oftentimes brought up by pro-choice Catholics that, Aquinas and Augustine say that abortion prior to quickening is not homicide. And I'll get to that in a second. But I think it is important to point out that prior to Aquinas, in fact, prior to Augustine, there is a precedent for Christian tradition holding that abortion is homicide, is murder. So the Didache, which is a second century document, which is, it's not scripture, but it was considered a moral authority in the early church. It explicitly addresses abortion, and it calls it murder. And then St. Basil of Caesarea, he refers to abortion as homicide. Aquinas and Augustine believe abortion after quickening, which I believe for Aristotle is 20 days for male fetuses and 40 for female. I don't exactly remember, but they think after quickening, abortion is homicide. And Aquinas says of abortion prior to quickening that if it is not homicide, then it is a sin second to homicide. So he clearly thinks it's a very serious sin. Now, the reasons why Aquinas thought abortion prior to quickening were not murder are kind of complicated, and we can go into those if we want. Basically, it has to do with his kind of like post-Aristotelian embryology, where he thought the sperm of the father was the formal principle of development, and that the menstrual fluid of the mother is the material principle. And you have this, form-matter hylomorphism. And because the sperm and the menstrual fluid are external to one another, the sperm is operating like a kind of artisan that's forming the menstrual fluid to eventually, at some point with quickening, they unite, and then it develops imminently. But prior to the union of the sperm and the menstrual fluid, there's an external principle operating upon the matter. And that's why the menstrual fluid is not a genuine life, right? Because its principle of development is something external to it in the way that, a tool or an artifact has an external principle of development. The hammer, its principle of motion is the person wielding it. And that's kind of a comparable example. Now, we all know now that that's not the way embryology works, which is why in the 20th century, the Catholic Church definitively took a pro-life position that held that at the moment of conception, the zygote, because it's a distinct organism that develops imminently, it doesn't have an external principle that's using it in the way that Aquinas thought. That's why the Catholic Church has this strongly pro-life position now. So a lot of people will cite Aquinas and they'll say, this is why abortion in the first trimester might be permissible. Well, what they obscure is the fact that the only reason why Aquinas, he didn't think it was permissible, but the only reason why he thought it might not be homicide is because he had this scientifically incorrect embryology. So, we can get into that if we want, but I think there is a strong Christian precedent for this. And the Catholic Church, even the Renaissance, was saying that abortion was murder. There were popes who were trying to suppress the practice in Italy. Obviously, abortion does have a very ancient practice. It wasn't invented in 1973. So finally, I guess Richard says that abortion is a very nasty act. And this is something that Zen Shapiro in the previous debate brought up, and I think he was right to press Richard on, even if he didn't do so effectively, that if we think that abortion is a nasty act, it's kind of an unfortunate alternative to birth control. And birth control would be better, but unfortunately, people make mistakes, and abortion's this kind of concession that we have to make to human nature.
Right.
I think that we have to explain why is it that we think that abortion is this nasty act, that we have this fundamental intuition, perhaps we'd call it a moral intuition, that there's something unseemly about abortion. And we think that our intuitions aren't just inexplicable feelings that we have. They're usually a sign of some sort of moral or practical commitments that we have. I think the obvious explanation for why we think abortion is a nasty act is there's something valuable about the fetus. Not instrumentally valuable. It's not that this is another future possible worker or soldier that's been lost. It's that human life does have an intrinsic value, and that the fetus being murdered in abortion as a violent act, in some way we're disrespecting something sacred, even if we don't recognize it. I think that's kind of implicitly at work in most of our consciences. So I think that there's a question for Richard. Why should we think that abortion is a nasty act? Why should we think that this is something unfortunate at all? A lot of the pro-choice movement will say, on the one hand, you should shout your abortion and celebrate it. On the other hand, that abortion is something deeply traumatic to women. But they won't explain why is it traumatic. And I think that if you actually were to investigate, why is this something traumatic and unfortunate? Well, you say, well, it's something that's shameful. It's something that we shouldn't shout because it's actually deeply morally reprehensible. So I guess that's kind of, I don't know if that covers everything. Richard could bring up if there's something I dropped or.
Well, I had two just quick clarifications before Richard responds. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. Your defense was not so much biblical as it was relating to the early church fathers, correct? So you're not making a strictly biblical defense?
Yeah, I think that scripture on the question of abortion is indeterminate, and that if there are the resources to make a pro-life case, then they're going to have to be interpreted. So I would appeal to the Catholic theological tradition on this. So I would cite the church fathers and the scholastics.
Okay, and just the last quick one. You believe that all life is created equal, yes?
It depends on what you mean by equal. I think all life has a certain dignity.
Right, of an intrinsic value that's equivalent, regardless of the type of the life.
I don't know if I would say equivalent, actually, but I guess I would say all life has a certain dignity that means it should not be treated instrumentally. It should be regarded as inherently valuable.
I'll just say, go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I was just going to say if it's equally dignified or equally valuable, I think is a question I'm not quite sure how to answer. But because I do think, for example, certain lives in certain respects are more valuable than others. God does love certain people more than others. And he loves them in virtue of their differences in goodness. So, and some of those differences could be intrinsic. So I don't know if I would say that all lives are created equal, but they all have a certain intrinsic dignity.
Yeah, sure. He loved Esau. He loved Jacob and not Esau, which is a kind of a difficult thing for Catholics and Protestants, actually. It's something they have to deal with. I'll say two things. First off, yes, I am not Sarah Silverman, and I am not going to say that women should announce their abortions. In this way, I sort of agree with the Roe decision in the sense that they discovered a clause of privacy of some sort in the Constitution. Now, I wish this issue had not been solved by the Supreme Court. I think it is an issue that needs to be in the open and addressed definitively, and not out of judicial act of discovering something that was clearly not written in the Constitution, not even considered really in the Constitution. I also have granted that it is a rather nasty act. I would absolutely prefer some kind of contraception or prophylactic of some sort, even if it's simply withdrawing. Now, I'm not going to go down the road of a lot of, Richard Dawkins type, where they would say that, they would autistically extrapolate a Catholic position and say that any time you don't ejaculate inside a woman, you're almost committing an abortion or something like this. I think this is, again, taking things too far. And it's engaging in this realm of just rationality and not really engaging in the real world. The fact is, for most all women, an abortion is traumatic in some way. And I think it is something that we don't want to talk about because we do recognize on some level, and I think even the Egyptian women in the 15th century BC recognize this, that there is a life form inside you of some kind. You are ending that. Given a few more months, it could have been a fully developed human being. And that this is an act that we shouldn't really talk about. I'm reminded of a Hemingway short story. I'm forgetting the title of it at the moment, but the euphemism in that short story was, "You're just going to let a little air out." And again, that irony, tragic irony, only resonates because we understand that abortion is wrong. That kind of tragic irony wouldn't resonate in a Sarah Silverman world where we should be, creating jokey memes about our latest abortion. That is rather grotesque. So I will actually grant Kleutgen quite a bit on this matter because I'm an honest person. I've never been involved with an abortion. I don't want to be. But again, we have to return to many of the things that I spoke of before, in the sense of looking at history, looking at even something like polling data and seeing how that reveals a certain reasoning on behalf of people across millennia. And that actually is very significant. It might not be an argument in the kind of Twitter sphere or something, but that is actually very significant and should give us pause when we declare that we should end this practice altogether and, in fact, execute women who commit an abortion, as Kleutgen has suggested, I think in a very sincere and reasonable manner, I would say, and not out of any kind of malice. I think it's a very sincere. But I think we do need to look at that. And I could flip this on its head and make an argument that maybe Kleutgen isn't quite prepared for. But before I do that, I'm going to address one thing. Now, Kleutgen is claiming, as a Catholic, he's claiming that his justification for the pro-life cause comes from Catholic theology and not necessarily the Bible. The Bible is, you could say quiet or silent, or maybe you could say ambiguous on the matter. All of those words are correct on some level. I think he's in a way wrong on that count. I do think that there is a Jewish justification for the pro-life cause coming from this revolution in thinking that man is created in the image of God. For the ancient Jews, I think that was actually for those who wrote the Hebrew Bible, I think that was almost a problem, in the sense that Jews were in the image of God and they therefore would disobey Yahweh, which again is the foundation of that religion. They were almost too godly in the sense that they weren't listening to his commandments. They were tempted to engage in idolatry of other forms, etc. I do think that that's the foundational standpoint. And I wonder if that's really the best standpoint. That is not the idea of being created in the image of God is not the standpoint of Hesiod. And I don't think it should be the standpoint for us living in the 21st century. We have the capacity and the ability to generate a race that is a human race, that is healthier, that is more beautiful, that is more generous, that is more athletic, that is more productive. And I don't mean just merely as a worker and a cog in a machine, but productive in a great sense of the word. We do have the knowledge and the ability of the consciousness to create a better world. And if you want to call that eugenics, you can. It is something that we take for granted with all other species, but we aren't willing to go there yet in terms of the population as a whole. Now, on an individual level, of course, we're willing to go there. Everyone wants their son to marry a beautiful woman. Every parent wants their daughter to marry a man who's wealthy or productive or handsome or athletic or at the very least interesting. We are all eugenicists when it comes to the individual. I don't think we're quite willing to be eugenicists when it comes to the population as a whole. But I do think that level of consciousness has been present at certain instances in history and can be present again. Now, to flip the nastiness granting that I gave Kleutgen, I do grant that it's a nasty thing. We could kind of flip that on its head in a way. And that is that if a woman is seeking an abortion, and in fact, we should remember that 50% of those women who get abortions are on their second or third. They've had an abortion before. So even that 20% of women by the age of 30 who've had an abortion is a little bit deceptive. If a woman is continually acting in this way, either there was a very traumatic incident, such as rape or incest, or many of these exceptions that people make. And I think we should show a lot of generosity in those cases. Or this woman is very nasty. And let's just be honest about that fact. A woman who announces her abortion on Twitter is a nasty woman. She is doing a nasty deed, and she is a nasty human being, and she is going to have nasty as hell children. If we recognize that fact, then maybe we can reach a conclusion that forcing or at least cajoling that woman to have more children really isn't in the best interest of the human race. And that one can be cruel only to be kind in order to allow all of these women to, voluntarily remove their lines from the gene pool. And that revolution in Genesis, this notion that man is made in the image of God, though that could be inspiring to some, I think it actually leads to a lot of bad effects. It leads to a kind of overestimation of humanity as it is. This notion that everyone's special, that all lives matter, or Black Lives Matter, or usually the counter, the rejoinder to Black Lives Matter is White Lives Matter, whatever. The ultimate reality is that no lives matter. That we can matter if we are part of a larger, and I think ultimately planetary movement towards the amelioration of the world and towards a creation of a healthier, stronger, more intelligent, more beautiful, more self-conscious human race. That if there is a meaning to the world, it is that. And it's not just reproducing the human race as it is right now, flaws and all. I was talking with Edward Dutton about some research that he's performing right now. at this point in time, we are, according to Ed, literally breeding for heart disease. We are breeding for stupidity. We are breeding for obesity on some level in the sense that that's connected to intelligence. And we could be doing so much more if we stop overestimating man as he is today, as in the image of God. I agree, a Christian does not necessarily think that all men are created equal or something, but all men are created special on some way. If, even as a Catholic, you accept Genesis. I think there are a lot of problems to that basic worldview, and that we need to replace it with a much more aspirational, but on the other hand, much more hard-headed worldview about breeding a higher state of man, that we can actually be better than this.
So obviously I want to give Kleutgen a lot of room to respond. There was a lot there, but I just want to make one pointed question. And if you could be relatively brief, that would be good, Richard.
Sure, I can't, but go ahead.
In Kleutgen's view, there is at least a standard, a sort of eugenic standard guiding reproduction, what have you. In your view, the image of the God being the standard. In your view, I mean, what is this ideal? How is this selection process being made? How are you quantifying this type of person that would arise because of abortions?
I'm saying that as it is, as the practice is today, it's a kind of filtering or self-selection for nearsighted, dumb, nasty people.
Sure,
they
but you are proposing,
and they're not killing themselves. I think to commit suicide is to overcome this most basic instinct. That's asking too much, but they are voluntarily removing their line. They're getting out of the game. They're going to the sideline because the game is ultimately what this world is going to look like in the future. And they're voluntarily saying, I'm off on the sidelines. And that is good.
Okay. Let's not belabor that. Kleutgen, you have the floor.
Sure, thanks. So I guess I'll just take this as kind of like a line-by-line response of points that Richard made, and we can see what's kind of decisive and move on. So remember, he addressed contraception very briefly early on. I just thought it'd be worthy to point out. I know Richard will laugh at this, but I think contraception is also bad. Artificial contraception and probably even natural family planning is bad. Now
we're not even allowed to withdraw. Is what you're saying?
No, you can't.
Okay. Well, you have the courage of your convictions. I will give you that.
Yeah, in principle, I think this is correct. Now, whether contraception should be illegal, I think in principle it should. That's just totally politically inconceivable right now. I think even abortion's illegality in the United States, probably even in the most conservative states, an outright abortion ban would be difficult to implement. So, at some level, Richard is right to say he's talking about the real world, what's politically achievable, and I'm not. I'm defending a fringe extremist point of view, so that's just kind of the nature of this debate. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, just as a quick aside. Now, on kind of this intrinsic nastiness of abortion, I was reminded there's an article by Naomi Wolf, who's kind of a shitlib, but maybe somewhat more thoughtful than a lot who are around today. And I don't remember if it was in the New York Times or something. It was quite a while ago. But she said that women should be encouraged to mourn their abortions. So perhaps we should even have graveyards or sites of where these women should recognize how sad it is that they I mean, she wouldn't put it quite in these words, but they murdered their own children. And and they should realize the moral gravity of that act. Nonetheless, Naomi Wolf was obviously pro-choice. I think that that's a good case of actual like intellectual honesty from someone like Naomi Wolf, and I can kind of respect the position. I myself used to be extremely pro-choice, and probably not as morally serious as she was. So I can respect it. And I've known women, and even women I've deeply cared about. It might be shocking to think that I've cared about women before, but who have had abortions, and they were deeply traumatized by it. Which I think is in itself a kind of argument against abortion. Now, I know that the empirical literature is kind of spotty on this issue. I think Richard would agree with me that there are all sorts of political pressures affecting the academy, why they will not, publish certain studies, will publish others, about how many women actually regret their abortions. I'm not sure the percentage of women who will say that they regret their abortion is very high, but I would be willing to guess that the percentage of women who do suffer psychological trauma as a result of their abortions is fairly high. I would say, as a Catholic, there are strong just a priori reasons to think that abortion does damage your soul. And that will be reflected in your psychological and probably even physical health, because the soul is the form of the body. And I think that in itself is a kind of paternalistic justification for abortion restrictions, that out of concern for women and their health, and I don't mean this in a kind of white knighty way, but like they do damage themselves through abortion. Now, I mean, a lot of that will come down to debates about whether abortion restrictions are actually effective, which is like a whole complicated empirical literature that we probably couldn't resolve in a debate like this. But there's evidence on both sides. I think that it's at least the case that abortion would reduce, abortion restrictions would reduce the rate of abortion. Now, anyway, Richard is right to point out there's a Jewish justification for the pro-life cause in this view in Genesis that man is created in the image of God. Now, I did say that there are passages in Scripture which implicitly point to the pro-life position. Obviously, this is not directly tied to the question of abortion, so you have to think it through. But I do think that this view is fundamental to the pro-life position. As far as I can tell, and I might be wrong about this, so Richard or anyone else could correct me, I don't think that there is a precedent for pro-life moral thinking or anti-abortion moral thinking prior to the advent of Christianity. That all of the pagan ancients did believe in the legitimacy of abortion. Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics all thought abortion was permissible. The Stoics specifically thought abortion up until the moment of birth, I believe they thought, was permissible because it was with birth, with entering into the world, that you take your first breath. And God is, they call pneuma, the breath of the world, and with that first breath, you become ensouled. You take in the spirit of God, because they have this kind of pantheist view. So I do think this is a uniquely Christian doctrine. I'm not sure if the pre-Christian Jews held to this position, but it's probably implicit within Genesis. It's implicit within this view that man is created in the image of God. I think Christianity brings it to its fullest actuality. I think it's worth pondering, in what sense does the Christian, specifically the Catholic, believe that man is created in the image of God? Well, the view is that this has to do with our essential rational nature, that in Greek the term is a hegemonikon, the view that the ruling principle, hegemonikon, of man is reason. Unlike animals who are ruled by instinct, that human beings do have a kind of reflective faculty of principles, a capacity to grasp the universal. And this is what it means to be a mind. God is the divine mind, an infinite mind, cosmic reason, and we are finite minds. So what it means to be human is to be the sensuous embodiment of spirit, of mind. So that's literally to be an image of God. To be an image is to be a kind of pale reflection, a derivative form of that which is in itself. That the divine mind is rational in itself. Man is a kind of reflection of this nature. And this reflection is the divine mind in its externality. It is within nature, within the sensuous world. So I think that is what explains the Christian commitment to the intrinsic worthiness of human life. Now, I don't think you need Christian scripture to hold that position. I think that a kind of rational transcendental anthropology. I'm very interested in the German idealists, so I think that probably my biggest influence is Hegel, and he would be committed to a similar position. Now, of course, I interpret Hegel as a kind of Orthodox Lutheran Christian, which is, I guess, an unusual interpretation of Hegel today. I think historically it's a common one. But point being that I think that someone wouldn't have to make recourse to Scripture to hold this position. Now, Richard got into this argument about eugenics. I think this is another area where this is ending up more of a discussion than a debate. I actually agree. I think abortion probably does have eugenic effect. Again, Twitter TOS prevents me from getting into detail about why abortion has a eugenic effect, but I think it does. However, we have to consider, why does the eugenic argument matter? Now, on the one hand, my go-to reply to this would be that I think that even if there is some good which we achieve through our actions, there are constraints on the means that we can consider to realize that good. I think the intrinsic wrongness of abortion, the fact that it is murder, which is, I think, the core of the debate that we can get to, constrains us from actually adopting this means to realize a eugenic outcome. But second, I do think that there are other consequences which, if they don't outweigh the eugenic benefit, at least mitigate its magnitude, its significance. So, for example, if we think that the reason why the eugenic argument for abortion matters is that we want to encourage a more virtuous, intellectually gifted, beautiful population, which I think is a worthy goal. We should encourage that, and we should adopt eugenic means to bring that about by encouraging families of such people to reproduce. There still are reasons why we think that abortion might actually reduce this. For example, I think it's clear that the legalization of abortion and the fact that this has become a part of women's liberation politics, of the sexual revolution, of all of these various liberal emancipatory movements, it has produced a kind of moral coarsening of our culture. That the Catholic Church oftentimes speaks about the culture of death. That abortion kind of coarsens us. It makes us insensitive to the intrinsic worth of human life, and it produces a kind of consumerist, flippant approach to sexuality and matters of life and death. And to the extent that perhaps abortion does eliminate certain people who otherwise would be intellectually or morally inferior, and I'm not sure that we're better off without those people. After all, we need people who are across the spectrum of intellectual capability. But even if we were to grant that, I think as a whole, it does kind of damage the intellectual and moral character of culture. Now, it's an empirical hypothesis, which one kind of outweighs the other as far as the moral health of our culture is concerned. And that's not the sort of thing that you can resolve by study. It's just a speculative matter. But I think it should at least make us a little bit skeptical about this eugenic argument for abortion. Now, that said, I would say this is the strongest argument for the pro-choice position. And I'm not even sure I would say it's a pro-choice position. It's the strongest argument for a pro-abortion position, because it does highlight a genuine public good, which is the health of the body politic, instead of an illusory private good, which is the free choice of women. And I do think that that's at least kind of morally serious. I just think that Richard goes too far, because I think abortion is intrinsically immoral. I think that's basically responsive to what Richard said. Generally speaking, I would say that the core of my argument does hinge on this view that man is created in the image of God. Now, man as he is does not perfectly reflect that image. That's true. I would think that Christian anthropology, which accepts our inherently fallen nature, it would clearly accept that. Morally, we do not reflect the image of God. Now, intellectually, in terms of beauty and physical capability, Catholics, perhaps more than Protestants, have historically been willing to admit that there's a wide spectrum, that the human race itself is kind of arranged hierarchically. There are people who are superior to others intellectually, morally, in terms of aesthetic quality. But, I mean, those people are still intrinsically valuable. And the whole spectrum of human beings, each according to their own character, do have a kind of inner worth. that is worthy of being preserved. I think that's kind of the core of my position. Perhaps Richard would like to respond at this point, unless there's something that I'm missing. Jan might point out in case I've forgotten something.
I know that was an excellent response. I'll make two brief points in terms of the coarsening of our culture, which is a phrase I've certainly heard quite a bit. And then I'll make a larger point about eugenics, but I think I've said my piece on that end. I would push back on the notion that, after Roe v. Wade or after the wide availability of abortion providers, that our culture has become coarsened and we just don't respect life and we treat people as objects or animals or something like that. I think quite the opposite has been the case. I think we love life far too much, and that the pro-life cause is a kind of outgrowth of this immense comfort that we enjoy in the post-industrial world. I do think that a pro-life movement is uniquely Christian, or you could say uniquely Jewish, to be even more honest, in the sense that it is fundamentally based on that revolutionary conception of man offered in Genesis. And that in a way, not that you couldn't find exceptions to this, of course, but in a way, only a Christian or only a Jew could be pro-life in this sense. On another level, I think that this pro-life cause kind of fits in to our post-industrial, post-modern culture, where we are terrified of harm, that we don't see death in the way that other peoples of other cultures have seen death, where it is everywhere. It's there in your life as a farmer or butcher. It's there. It's ever present in your life in terms of dealing with older people, dealing with warfare, dealing with all sorts of things. That we live in the end of history, where through the marvels of industrialization, we love life a little too much. And we're terrified not only of someone dying, but of someone getting bullied at school. That this is considered a kind of crime against humanity. I'm not suggesting that that's Kleutgen's perspective. He seems more based, but that is a very broad perspective. And that we're clinging to life a little too much and not looking beyond the status quo and looking beyond the current human being and trying to achieve something greater, trying to achieve a human race that will surpass us. In the ancient world, not only was abortion tolerated, as Kleutgen is saying, but famously or infamously, exposure was also a part of life. Child death was certainly a part of life. That is, child mortality was a part of life, but even active child mortality, that is, exposing people who are clearly not a benefit to the human race. We now see that as something terrible. I think you could, as opposed to the coarsening of the culture, I think I would point to a kind of softening of the culture. We're not willing to be cruel anymore. We're not willing to see a goal beyond mere existence and beyond mere life as it is that we can push towards. And I think if anything expresses the nihilistic attitude, it is that just clinging to life as it is and not seeing something greater and higher. I appreciate the fact that Kleutgen I appreciate the fact that he agrees with me on many points, of course. But I don't think he's doing that for any other reason than the fact that he's being honest. And that he grasp that abortion might, as it is, might very well be eugenic on the whole, and that eugenics is good, that, and he would want to encourage beautiful, intelligent, strong, healthy people to have families and to procreate. That's sincerely expressed. I'm glad that he wants to do that, and I agree with him. But what is it that is holding us back from creating a race that is superior to ourselves? What is it? Why can't we go there? And the reason is this Jewish and Christian moral injunction against this that is based, I would suggest, ultimately in Genesis, and this notion that you're created as an icon of Elohim. You're everyone's special. Why are we going to allow this to hold us back any longer? And I don't think we're going to change the world with this space, or that Kleutgen and I are going to be in charge of the government anytime soon, granted. But it has to start somewhere, and I think it has to start intellectually, or it has to start psychologically, you could say. That we need to rid ourselves of anything that is holding us back from achieving a humanity that surpasses us, that is superior to us, that looks on us as we look upon apes. That is a good thing. And at some point, we have to discard any kind of moral injunction or any kind of self-conception that prevents us from doing that. And I'll leave it at there.
So just a quick, a little prodding you on some of what you've said, and obviously Kleutgen will have plenty of time to respond. So if Kleutgen's view, or the Catholic view, the Christian view, the Judeo-Christian view, esteems life too highly, and because it esteems life too highly, that you have all of this genetic and cultural detritus just promulgating itself over and over and over again at the expense of the future glory of the human race. Let's just flip that on its head and say that your eugenic, cautiously pro-abortion worldview does the exact opposite. It esteems death too highly. What would be to keep it from sliding into some kind of Logan's Run scenario where you have some kind of psychotic rule by like the truly pernicious, and people are expelled because they're too old, because they have a cough, because of, I'm being a little bit flippant here, but for XYZ reason where there's not a clearly defined ideal or code which is governing this eugenic process. For everything we could say about Kleutgen's, all the criticisms we could make of Kleutgen's view or the Catholic view, there is a clearly defined avatar, that's Christ. There's a clearly defined doctrine that organizes all these kinds of things in terms of its outcomes, for better or worse. Obviously, that's what the point of this conversation is about, but that seems to be lacking in your side of the conversation.
Well, the short answer is that we're going to have to risk it. No risk it, no biscuit, as they say. And I don't really have a stronger answer to that, other than Kleutgen's view, which is sincerely expressed and articulated in a absolutely coherent fashion, is a minority view, and an increasingly smaller minority view. It might be gaining on Twitter, but at least in terms of what people say, not necessarily of what they do and think. But it is a minority view. I think the Christian world is a bit hollow, and it's being hollowed out decade by decade. And so we're going to have to risk it. We're going to have to pass over this horizon, and we're going to have to risk some horrifying totalitarian, which of course everyone on this call would oppose, who wants to I don't know, engage in a kind of active dysgenics, or engage in something with just the utmost sadistic cruelty and a total irrationality. We're going to have to risk that in order to achieve something higher. Because the current state of affairs is that we're living in a post-Christian world. We're not living in an a-Christian world or an anti-Christian world. We're living in a kind of post-Christian world where there are all these echoes of the past. There are certain moral injunctions, certain moral values that have persisted, but have been hollowed out and kind of become so diffuse that they don't really have a hold on us anymore. And we're just going to have to risk taking that step forward.
Kleutgen, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I guess, there are kind of 2 points here. One is just really quick thing that Richard said that I want to get out of the way. And then the other is, I think, the core question, which I think might be the core question of the debate. So, first, is this a uniquely Christian and Jewish idea, the view that man is created in the image of God? I think in some sense, the inherent, the pro-life movement is uniquely Christian, historically at least. And this respect for the dignity of human nature, I think, only does emerge with Christianity. It doesn't have adequate precedent in Greco-Roman paganism. Nonetheless, as a Catholic, I do have great appreciation for the Greco-Roman tradition. And I do think that there's an intellectual precedent for this view of human nature as reflecting the divine nature in, for example, Aristotle. So, what is Aristotle's God? Well, for Aristotle, God is the pure act of thought thinking itself, which is the theory of God that's preserved in the Christian tradition from, Aquinas to Hegel. And, what is man in his fullest actuality for Aristotle? Well, man is the philosopher, one who takes part in the divine activity of considering his own thinking. For Hegel, this would be absolute knowledge, self-consciousness come to its full realization in absolute spirit. Thinking about itself, philosophy, thought considering its own conditions. And I think that there is a thread that runs from the Hellenistic tradition, I guess Aristotle's pre-Hellenistic, but the Greek tradition into Christianity, which is why I think that Christianity cannot be thought of merely as some permutation of Judaism or the bastard child of Judaism. Christianity is a synthesis between Jewish revelation and Greek philosophy. That the inherent aspirations of Greek philosophy was itself unable to make good on and required Hebraic revelation, which is the justification of Christianity from the Catholic perspective, at least. That might be an interesting topic to get into, which is my second point in response to Richard, that Richard talks about the coarsening of the culture and our post-Christian civilization, or I should say the softening of the culture, the fact that our culture is not coarsening, and our post-Christian civilization. So for one thing, I, again, would agree with Richard to some extent that in certain respects, our culture is softening. I am pro-bullying. That Sam Hyde's skit about the need of bullies at schools to weed out the weak, I think is important. But our culture is riddled with tensions and contradictions. In some sense, we are coarsening. We're increasingly kind of hedonistic and consumeristic, shallow and insensitive to deep moral demands. Not only respect for human life, but this is something that Richard might be able to appreciate as well. Aesthetic sensibility. That there is no genuine high culture in the Western world anymore. Or at least there's only like the kind of fraudulent high culture in the Western world. Aesthetic taste has declined. That if you look at the standards of a Harvard admissions application in 1890, they were expected to be able to write in Latin and Greek, and knowledge of French and German was not uncommon. I think now a Harvard undergraduate, upon finishing their 4 years, it would be a good thing if they were even conversational in any other language but English. Maybe that's complicated by the fact that so many of them are foreign students, but there is a decline in aesthetic and intellectual standards, and I think that does reflect a kind of coarse instrumentality of our culture that is insensitive to things which are valuable in themselves, amongst which I would list human life, but not only human life, things like aesthetic beauty, that our sense of taste and our moral sensitivity has declined. And this is kind of a trad meme, I guess, but just listening to modern music, listen to Nicki Minaj, and then not just Dvorak, but even low culture of the 19th century, some pub violin music, and I think that you'll find that our culture is coarsening in many ways. But it is also softening. I think the COVID pandemic is a good example of a case where we are absolutely terrified of death. We're run by a kind of geriocracy that on mortality, the boomer generation that prioritizes extending their own lives. In some case, with respect to the very elderly, extending their own lives by a few months. This is not only the COVID case. I know COVID politics can be a little bit complicated in these spheres, but kind of end of life care in the West is a good example of this. That millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars we spend on extending the lives of the elderly by a few months. We do have a kind of obsessive fear of death. I think that there are kind of a few reasons for this. Some of these are metaphysical. We cease to view life as inherently dynamic. It is just a kind of static state to be preserved for the sake of hedonistic enjoyment. You're just consuming utils until you run out, rather than realizing some form of life at which your life is ultimately justified, and it's justified in terms of its contribution to the community, to the preservation of the human race, and partly due to eschatological reasons that we no longer have a view of the afterlife. Even most Christians don't consider the afterlife very seriously. They do. I think Nietzsche is right that the vast majority of Christians today are implicitly atheists. So I think that produces a kind of obsessive fear of death. We do need some kind of conception of immortality in order to justify our own lives. The movie Children of Men is very good on this point. I haven't read the book, but I understand the book is quite a lot more based than the movie. But the movie points out the interesting part that for those of you who don't know, there's a collapse in global human fertility. That the last human being to be born was born 18 years ago. The movie opens with that person dying. Spoilers: the first 2 minutes of the movie, and human life becomes kind of unlivable under these conditions. That there is no future. The human race does die out with this generation. And therefore, there is no mortality, that our deeds don't ring out for eternity. We're just kind of staring down this long, empty, dark corridor of nothingness. There's a scene where one of the characters is collecting art from, I don't know if it's Madrid or something. They insinuate the city's been nuked or something like that. And he basically kind of acknowledges, like, this is all worthless. There's nobody who will appreciate it after me. I do think it's essential to vindicating the value of human life that we do have some conception of our immortality. Now, you could say, this is a 19th century view that I'm sympathetic to. Fichte argued this, that our immortality is preserved in the nation, that we have Hegel and Marx call this Gattungswesen. We have species being, that the humanity as such reproduces itself intergenerationally. And it's that intergenerational succession of human beings in virtue of which we have our immortality. And there's some truth to that, but I think one of the problems with this view is that it can't guarantee our personal immortality. That to be a human being, to be spirit, is to be an individual, and that the individual is lost in the species. Animals have species kind; they have species being that reproduces itself, but they don't have individuality that is reproduced through the species. The only spirit has that, which is part of what it means to be a human being. So I don't think anything can save us from modern nihilism except some sort of return to genuine spirituality. But I think at least in the Western world, only Christianity can supply this kind of return. Islam has no appeal to Westerners. I also think there are theological problems with Islam. Judaism is obviously not a convert religion that appeals to us. I think there are intellectual problems with Judaism. And then I would also object to Richard, and this might be an interesting point of debate as well. I don't think that any form of constructed religion or neo-paganism can appeal to us. I mean, it can appeal to us on some level, but I don't think it can quite do the job. We need a kind of eros, a love of the divine, which I think only Christianity really takes seriously as the consummation of revealed religion. That, what Dante refers to as the love that moves the sun and the stars, which is that which the human being wants to see in the beatific vision. That can only be realized under a Christian theology where the divine actually condescends to become incarnate in human nature. Now, there's no other religion, as far as I know, no other serious mass religion, that purports that the divine as such becomes incarnate within a particular individual human being. And without that view of the divine descending into human form, the divine always is this kind of elusive infinite, and the infinite infinitely transcends the finite. That human beings, through their own resources, will never be able to realize this, which is the failure of Greco-Roman philosophy. The reason why it needed Hebraic revelation is Greco-Roman philosophy in its most ecstatic form, which is Neoplatonism, posited the divine as something which is absolutely other, and which we, through, I guess, theurgy, could possibly communicate with. But the kind of return that was promised by Plotinus and Proclus can't be made good on in human terms. And this is the reason why Christianity posits the necessity of grace. So I guess I'm kind of rambling here, but I think that there are profound theological reasons to think that if the West is to survive, if we are to have some kind of moral rejuvenation, only Christianity can offer that hope. And if you take, I think, empirically, there's really no reason to be hopeful. I think that, perhaps these traditionalist Christian communities do have high birth rates or whatever. Eric Kaufman, the sociologist, has done some studies on this. Mm-hmm. I'm not that enthused about this. I mean, from what I understand, traditionalist Catholics in France have rates of apostasy that keep their population pretty static. But maybe that's not true. Maybe there's some hope. I don't know. I think the Mormons, I don't like Mormons, but the Mormons have changed their position on contraception, so their birth rates are rapidly declining. But maybe we'll have to hope for some Amish future in the West. I'm being facetious here, obviously. I'm empirically, there's no hope. And I think that's the case for right-wing politics in general. Empirically, it's pretty black-filling. But there are theological reasons that I think are profound to have faith. And, given that, I think that we can hope that providentially there will be some sort of rejuvenation of Christianity, which at many times in history seemed unlikely. But the Catholic Church did have a rejuvenation in the Counter-Reformation. We were able to overcome the Arian heresies. So, yeah, I guess I would just end by that as kind of criticism of Apollonianism. But I think that Christianity is the only promise of this kind of moral rejuvenation for basic theological reasons that kind of condemn any alternative. But that's a big question that we can get into.
Right. I'll just interject again, because there was something you said that, at the risk of being pedantic. So you've already kind of admitted, Kleutgen, that some life, and I'm putting words in your mouth here a little bit, so don't take it personally, that some lives are effectively worth more than others. There's not an essential equality, but some lives are more valuable, but we essentially all have a basic dignity. Am I basically framing your view accurately?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. But then you also said that it's really unfair what these old people are doing to us with COVID to extend their own life. So you're telling us that life is a good, but gee golly, it's really awful that we would have abortions because of the importance of life. But it's also really awful that these elderly people who are uniquely at risk to this global pandemic, this COVID-19, and sidestepping entirely the legitimacy of COVID-19, that whole effing, that seems kind of odd to me. So, like a family that the mother gives birth to a profoundly autistic and catatonic child, that child's life is precious and important and special and deserves this protection because of this intellectual exercise of theology that you're going through. But it's really awful and nasty what 20 a group of 57-year-olds do because they're concerned they might get the coof and die.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to make this into a debate about COVID policy, which is, I mean,
but it's not about COVID policy. Just the elderly life, which has consciousness and can still give back to the community, versus again, and this is maybe a little bit of a niche case, but whatever, let's go with it. This life that will never live, basically.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just, apologizing for myself before I get into the answer, but. Yeah, I mean, I guess, the Catholic Church's phrase, they want to protect life from conception until natural death. And the reason why I bring up the case of the elderly in the case of COVID-19 is not so much to say that these policies are illegitimate, but I think that the way that we reason about these policies indicates a kind of discomfort with the idea of natural death. That a human being has a life that's allotted to them by providence. You're conceived, you have a kind of dignity where people should treat you a certain way. You should be accorded a family and certain resources that bring you into maturity, and then you die. And that is the natural way of things. And I just bring this up to show that, I think our culture is terrified of the inevitability of natural death. Even if you die at the age of 98 in your bed, comforted by your family, we still don't have the moral and spiritual resources to kind of reconcile ourselves to that fact. I don't bring this up to say, the COVID-19 thing, we shouldn't protect the elderly, we shouldn't have any sort of restrictions whatsoever. I'm just saying that the kind of hysteria that I think people have towards this, and maybe Richard would disagree with me, but I think that certain segments of the public are truly hysteric about...
I agree with that. I agree. Yeah.
That it does betray the fact that our culture is just totally morally incapable of reconciling itself to human mortality. That the boomer generation, I know it's very fad to shit on boomers, but they do deserve it. The boomer generation, in their mass apostasy, they have the sex, rock and roll, and drugs generation. They do just view human life as justified in terms of kind of mundane pleasures, and the fact that the song stops and that one day there'll be nothing but silence is something that they just can't deal with. I think COVID is a good case where you see a lot of these people who are still in control of public policy and still in control of all the financial and cultural resources of our society. They're just displaying all of this kind of neuroticism and hysteria for all of us to see. So I think that's the point. Now, there are other things I could say, there's a difference between taking certain risks that acknowledge that certain people will die from them. We could invest more in the highways to prevent a certain amount of deaths, and we can calculate how much money we would need to prevent a certain amount of deaths, but we don't do it because we don't think it's worthwhile. There's a difference between that and directly murdering an innocent human life. I think that's a profound moral difference, because I don't see this in consequentialist terms. I don't think it's a matter of saying some human lives are worth more than others, and we just need to minimize the really worthwhile ones that get killed and maximize the really bad ones that don't get killed. I think that there are kind of natural law constraints on what we can do because of the value of human life. I don't know if that probably answers the question, but...
Yeah, that's more than fine enough. Richard?
Well, there was so much there, and I really do appreciate Kleutgen's representation of the Christian worldview and the Christian view of the Greeks. And I obviously disagree, but I do appreciate his criticism of Apolloism and movements that are similar to it. I'm not going to address those. I feel like we've already gone close to an hour and a half, and I think it would be good to have questions. And they are a bit beyond the scope of the debate, although I do think that what we've been able to get at in this discussion is that the abortion question does derive ultimately from your sense of life. I actually think that Kleutgen despite his Catholicism, sorry, has a strong sense of life similar to my own. I would like to look very briefly at certain timely recent episodes that seem to reveal something about the pro-life movement that's important and essential. I remember back in 2004, now I know a lot of listeners are probably, they were in diapers at that point or something, but it was the case of Terry Schiavo. And this was a woman who was effectively brain dead, but who was kept alive through advanced medical technology. So in any other circumstance, she would have achieved something like a natural death. And her ex-husband, in fact, was making a decision to pull the plug, as it were. Now, of course, there's some complicated issues with ex-husbands making these decisions. God knows I wouldn't want my ex-wife making decisions about my life or death, but I think putting those things aside, which are a bit salacious, I think it ultimately got down to that question of, should you perpetuate life at all cost? Most all Catholics and most all pro-lifers made a very clear decision in this regard, that she needs to be perpetuated, that life must be perpetuated at whatever cost. And this was a kind of living death, a living oblivion, almost a kind of horrifying torture in a way, of not, from a Christian perspective, of not allowing her soul to escape to heaven. When the rubber hits the road, this is how pro-lifers and Christians and Catholics address these issues. They, in a way, love life too much. They aren't willing to be cruel in order to achieve a higher end. That there is a certain nihilism in loving life this much. Life is not in itself good. In fact, it's kind of mostly bad, if we're honest about it. Now, we could come to a conclusion of it were better that we were not born. But life is redeemed when we combine it with our will and bring it to a higher state of being. And I would again bring us back to this moral question of what is holding us back from achieving these things. It ultimately is a Jewish and Christian moral injunction against doing this, based on the notion that we are made in the image of God. If we don't value life in itself, but value life lived greatly, life lived productively, life lived in a way that advances our species, and that we do achieve a kind of immortality through our species, through our children, by seeing the reflection of your own eye in a child who can surpass you. That what is holding us back from that worldview if it isn't Christianity? And if we admit to that, then shouldn't that lead us to look upon that a bit skeptically and recognize that there is actually a great deal of wisdom in pre-Socratic philosophers, that there is a great deal of wisdom to post-German idealist thinkers such as Nietzsche, who address this head on. And that's what I would suggest to the audience. But I would like to hear their questions and comments. So I think we should go to that. But I would say thank you, Kleutgen, and I also really appreciate your presentation of what is a grand and coherent worldview. It's one that I do disagree with, one that I could poke holes in, of course, one that I could offer an alternative to, but I won't do that right now. But I do appreciate the fact that you are coming from somewhere. You are coming from a foundation. You have a perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought this was good. I was really interested to hear your criticisms and your view. So,
Well, we can do that some other time, but I'll have to do a lot of reading up before I'm able to face someone as formidable as yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely be interested. Yeah, I do take, for all of my criticisms, I do take Apollonianism seriously.
You do.
And I would absolutely be interested in a debate about that, if you're up for
We
it.
will definitely do that, particularly once the elusive book is published. We will absolutely do that.
What's the ETA on that, by the way?
It's getting better and better.
Okay. I'm looking forward to it then. Yeah.
All right. So I actually, Josh, I don't think I made you a host. I can do that right now just to give you those special powers. But I think we should maybe let some people jump in, and then maybe I'll send you a co-host invite, and then maybe try to wind it down after 2 hours, because I think that's a good amount of time.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't know if you sent that request. I don't even know how I would accept such a request.
Okay, I could just do it. You've been an excellent moderator, by the way, but I will. So if you'd like to speak, you can request to speak now, and we have a number of people here. I see there's Arthur F. If you would like to speak, you can be up first. Okay, Arthur.
The microphone is yours,
F,
Arthur.
Going once, going twice, gone. Okay, the next one, I'm just reading down my screen, is Iskandar. I don't see the rest of it, but Iskandar?
Yeah, is that me? Yep.
That's you.
Sure. So Islam was mentioned at some point in the conversation, and I think that an examination of the Islamic position on this can sort of strengthen Richard's point that the pro-life position is fundamentally a Jewish position, or at least Christian in the Judeo-Christian sense, because in Islamic society across history, they've never had this sort of pro-life position on abortion. It's obviously been considered something that's nasty, as you guys talked about, but not in the sense that, it has a soul and that sort of Catholic pro-life position. But the thing is that Muslims are actually coming around to that sort of Christian or Jewish pro-life position more these days, as they become influenced by American conservatism. And so I think that also shows sort of the Judeo-Christian foundation of that pro-life position.
That's interesting. I'll let you speak on that, Kleutgen.
Yeah, because you have, they call it the Ark-right, as in Achi, as in brother, instead of alt-right, which is sort of, these Muslim shit posters. And I think some of us were exposed to that with the Taliban guy who was posting these ridiculous memes, and yeah. And I think also in terms of, again, just from an Islam perspective on it being unappealing to Westerners was mentioned during the debate. I think that is true in terms of its sort of sterile, exoteric, Wahhabi form. I think it is very unappealing. But its more spiritual forms like Sufism, I think, can have a certain appeal, like Abdel Hakim Murad, also known as Timothy Winter, or Wene Guenon. And I think we don't have to accept Islam, but I think examining some of its principles and its own philosophies can help us deal with big problems. Like we talked about the West fundamentally being unable to reckon with our mortality. Well, Islam, its more spiritual forms, like I mentioned, Sufism, does deal with this, I think, in a sort of healthy way. They talk about dhikr al-maut, which is sort of remembrance of death or contemplation on it. And it's a way of sort of conquering death as this big scary thing and being at peace with it and not clinging to life in a sort of, sad way. So I think that, there are some spiritual answers to these sort of these questions of mortality.
Yeah, thanks. That was interesting. I don't know a lot about contemporary Islamic ethics. Now, Catholics obviously have a natural law tradition that's very prominent in our scholarship, and Muslims do too. But I don't know how significant that is among contemporary Muslim intellectuals, which might be something you can tell me about. So that's interesting as far as its influence on abortion and bioethics. As for Islam's appeal in the West, yeah, I do agree. There's a small number of Westerners who are interested in this. Western elites who are usually kind of like dissident, like Gwenon, and there are similar people who are interested in Hinduism, or Shinto or whatever. But I think this is a rare elite phenomenon, and the reason is largely just because Islam is radically foreign. It's not because there's something kind of theologically repugnant about Islam that would scare Westerners away. And maybe there is as well, but I think it's just not part of the broadly European and American patrimony, so it doesn't appeal to them. What does appeal to Westerners more, and I think that in some sense we'll see this rising more than renewal of Christianity in the short term, is just New Age religion that's kind of intellectually vacuous and is a kind of bastardized form of these Eastern religions, largely Buddhism and Hinduism. I think that does have some degree of mass appeal among youth in the United States and Europe. More intellectually serious forms of Islam, I don't think will have many converts. I mean, I have seen these little videos by the BBC and The Economist of their interviews of white British converts to Islam. For some reason, they're all fucking gingers. I don't know why, but they're these gingers who are they're probably socially ostracized or whatever, so they feel like there's a sense of community, which I can sympathize with. A lot of traditionalist Catholics are like this. They're traditionalist Catholics who are from kind of atomized backgrounds, and I mean they don't start off as traditionalist Catholics. They're from atomized backgrounds, and they convert to Catholicism because they think it provides them a sense of historical orientation.
Yeah, I think it's the same with those ginger jihadi types, because it just becomes really obvious that they were looking for an identity, or looking for like you said, something to belong to, because they're attracted to that sort of radical hardline Islamism, because it gives them things to do every day and a routine and that's something, you know what I mean? Like, it's very for all of its religious rhetoric, it's a very material thing. It's a lot about what should I do with my body? What should I? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right.
All right. Let's go down the list. So I'm just doing this by the people who were made their requests first. So Rowden, I guess you were on my last space a lot, so you have the floor.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I will keep this brief, as in light of our prior vaccine discussion, it seems I may have contracted the coof. If anybody's interested, it's
again.
Very simple: 3-day cold, lungs, head cold, throat. That's about it for me, anyhow. I just want to make a basic statement. I am a lapsed Catholic. I am a social conservative. I am, I guess, a national socialist or a fascist or white, whatever the fuck you want to, broadly generalize me as. There is no point in having these discussions with people who self-identify as trad-Caths or Orthodox or Christians in general. You're essentially giving them a pulpit from which to bloviate and evangelize. By identifying with Christianity, they are by default telling you that they've already made up their mind. They're not allowed to have a difference in opinion from their church. If they are pro-life, they are always going to be pro-life. They already made the decision that they'll send us all to hell on earth if it means they can go to heaven. That's all.
Okay, well, that was strongly expressed. I would say that though there might be actually some commonality in our thinking, I am certainly more than willing to have this conversation, and we can have real fundamental disagreements and learn from one another. And so I don't regret at all inviting, Kleutgen, because he was very, very active. He kind of invited himself, but I mean that, I say that in praise. But I certainly do not have any regrets in platforming him. He has a very important and thought out perspective, and I'm willing to hear it and debate it.
Yeah, maybe I'm just being too agreeable, but to some extent, I think you're right. There's kind of no point in having any conversations on the right if we're measuring the significance of these things.
No. If your positions are logical, you can change your opinion, but your positions aren't based in logic or statistics or fact. They're based in subjective belief, so you can't just change them.
Okay, Ben Shapiro. Yeah. I mean, what I was going to say is at some level, if we think that these conversations are supposed to get us somewhere politically, I mean, to get anywhere politically, we're going to have to think extremely long term. No matter what happens in 2024, and I don't say this to shit on Richard Spencer, but like Richard Spencer's not going to be president in 2024. Right. We're not going to get your like white ethno state anytime soon. So. I'm not even trying to ridicule you by saying like that's your expectation.
Oh, I didn't take it that way. No, it's just being realistic. Yeah.
Oh, I don't mean. I mean ridicule the caller.
Okay.
Yeah. Of course, I wouldn't ridicule you, Richard. But yeah, it's just a lot of these conversations are just life of the mind type stuff that I think that Richard and I take seriously. Just having these debates to be intellectually stimulating, to consider the moral question of abortion. And it's not going to change policy. These are just debates that we enjoy. The nature of philosophy is you enjoy knowledge for its own sake. Now, whether my positions are based in facts and logic or whatever Ben Shapiro takes. No, I think that for a long time, like I was a Catholic apostate. I grew up in a Catholic household and became an atheist, and then returned to Catholicism for philosophical reasons, not because I thought it was pretty, and not because I had some spiritual experience. In fact, I would say that I'm a pretty spiritually desolate Catholic. I'm not the most personally devout person. So, yeah, I would say that the Catholic intellectual tradition does not have this sharp division between faith and knowledge. It does not have this view that, like, it's just a kind of radical decision, salto mortale, a dive off the cliff into faith, where we don't have to consider, rational objections. Richard could very well convince me. It's probably not the sort of thing that would happen in an hour and a half long conversation. He could very well convince me that Christianity is false. And there could be rational arguments to be had at that point. Now, I mean, I think there is a question about the priority that we give to religious considerations over political, or political considerations over religious. Do you prioritize your race over the church? That is a real conflict that I think is present on the right, the dissident right. Mm-hmm. And I fall on one side, and Richard doesn't have church. Well, you might be Episcopalian in some way. They're kind of slippery that way.
Oh yeah, I'm a devout Episcopalian. Yes.
I remember you did say that you went to Episcopalian Christmas or something somewhat recently, or something like that.
Yeah, no, I attend church fairly regularly, maybe more than you.
I did go to church yesterday. Yeah,
okay.
I go to the Tridentine Mass. So
okay.
But yeah. Anyway, I just mean to say there is a genuine conflict. Leo Strauss wrote about the conflict between philosophy and revelation, and politics and religion, and that's an interesting conversation. But I don't think that's a conversation that you should just say like, there's no point in having it as though political theologians like Carl Schmitt and political philosophers like Leo Strauss, they just can't talk to each other. Now, they are mutually intelligible, and there's value to be gained from a conversation like that. Anyway, I've gone on too long.
Yeah,
that's my answer.
Okay, I guess we'll now go to noted Richard Spencer fanboy Joel Davis. Please try to keep the compliments to a minimum, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, obviously I'm kind of on team Kleutgen. He's my homie, but I didn't. Rather than doubling down on that, I just wanted to bring up actually some words from your mentor, Richard Paul Gottfried, who made the point that the problem with abortion is that it suggests that we should allow women to make decisions, and this is generally bad politics. And the culture that it engenders, and this is kind of a different argument about abortion, I'm interested to hear both of your views, is essentially that it encourages the female to kind of view herself radically differently, rather than privileging her role as a kind of like creator of life, her maternal role. It engenders this radically different view of what the female is in society, which in many cases I think can be argued is quite negative. And so whilst maybe you could make the pragmatic argument that certain abortions are good for society, perhaps this overall effect of radically altering the role of the female in society is a price it's not worth paying. So I'm just curious to get both your thoughts on that concept.
I hear you, and I think you make a good point. I mean, in terms of reasserting patriarchal authority, that is such a grand objective, that the idea that this would happen through, the Texas law or overturning Roe v. Wade, I think is fairly naive, although I guess you could counter that you have to take one step at a time. Let me suggest my general view on this. This is something I really need to delve into more and bring out. I don't know if you've ever encountered Robert Graves' history of Greek mythology. It's a bit of an encyclopedia, but he does have a strong take on these matters, and you can actually find that at the very beginning of this book, 2 volumes usually. And that is that a maternal system, which would include a kind of maternal political dominance, predated what we would call patriarchy. And so it was a woman's world to the extent that Graves suggests that we didn't even understand that a man inseminated a woman, that a woman was this bounteous, fecund object that could produce children miraculously, and that she could, in a way, have sex for pleasure. And the sacrifice of a boy was a kind of religious act in this maternal system that would occur. And what Graves draws out of Greek myth is that it's that boy who will not die, that boy who asserts his right to live, and in fact will ultimately assert the phallus as the basic object of civilization. That is the foundation of patriarchy. It's not like, and I assume you would agree with this as well, because you have a deep understanding of history, that it's not like the patriarchy, ended in 1973 or with the Obama administration or something like that. That this is much, much deeper. And it's not simply about, say, Christian family values. It is really about asserting the male contribution to the perpetuation of life, and that the phallus is at the basis of civilization. I think, interestingly, we are, you could say, kind of returning to a matriarchal world. And we're not necessarily returning to pure sexual anarchy or sexual socialism. We're kind of returning to a matriarchal world slowly but surely. And it will be a kind of anti-civilizational world, where the woman can have sex for pleasure, the woman is totally in control. The man is not the governing force of civilization, represented by the phallus, but is, a boy toy, as it were. So I think you're actually getting at something bigger. I would say that we're not going to solve that issue by doing some kind of reactionary act like the Texas law or something like that. And I'm afraid that we're going to probably have to go through matriarchy. We're going to have to kind of pass through this great testing. We're going to have to learn who is a man, who can pass the ultimate shit test, which is within this context, which is of course, imperfect, who can perpetuate himself, who can pass the shit test, who can reproduce, who can get a girl despite it all. That's going to be a massive test, and not everyone's going to make it. But I don't think that there is a kind of answer outside of that. We're going to pass through a matriarchal system through historical development and its consequences. And we can't just kind of reassert patriarchy by, big bold memes on Twitter or whatever. And I don't think we're going to reassert patriarchy by adopting a religion that's been slowly hollowed out in recent times, and that is Christianity. I think we're going to have to pass through it and kind of suffer the consequences and be tested, and most people aren't going to make it. That was a very rambling way of addressing your point, but I think it's a kind of a deep one, so I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I was reminded, this doesn't really have any upshot what I'm going to say. I remember listening to a lecture back when I was in high school with some anthropologist. Made an interesting point. There are African tribes in which every man in the tribe has sex with pregnant women because they think that the purpose of semen is to supply the fetus with nutrients rather than inseminate the woman. So, apparently the biological connection between semen and insemination, pregnancy, is not a universal one.
Right, and it's not something we should just take for granted. At some point in human history, you had to assert that. Right.
That this development of a scientific connection, which is probably rooted in a more basic social form of sexual relationships that conditions science in its primitive form. That is not universal. That is extremely historically contingent, which is an interesting thing to think about. I don't have further thoughts on that. It's just an interesting thing to think about. I would say that I don't know if Richard disagrees with me on this, that Roe v. Wade in the United States, and then perhaps even to a greater extent, Griswold v. Connecticut, which struck down prohibitions against contraception, I think in the state of Massachusetts. Oh, yeah, obviously Connecticut. Duh. Mm-hmm. It was the Comstock laws, which were famous in Massachusetts, I think. But Griswold v. Connecticut, Massachusetts, early 1960s, struck down prohibitions against contraception. These did play an important legal role in decoupling sex from reproduction. There are more fundamental kind of anthropological and philosophical views that have to deal with the rejection of kind of natural theology and kind of the mechanical view of human nature, the kind of normative disenchantment of nature that plays a role in this delinking of sex and reproduction. The view that sex is just recreational and can be manipulated by technological control. But I do think that these landmark legal cases play a role in shaping public consciousness. And Griswold v. Connecticut is kind of the start of kind of the legal catalyst of the sexual revolution.
When did that come about?
Was that 1963? Let me look it up.
Okay.
For some reason, I keep thinking it's in the 1950s, but yes, 1965.
I mean, presumably contraception was widespread in use before that law was overturned, even in Connecticut.
It depended on the state. So I think what Griswold v. Connecticut struck down is that in the state of Connecticut, you couldn't get contraception from a pharmacist, but it was legally questionable whether you could get it mailed to you. You could be on the mail list. And that was like a way to get around it, and I think the state of Connecticut may have passed laws restricting that. I might be totally off, but this is what I vaguely remember from like AP US history. And I think this is one of the first cases where the Supreme Court asserts a right to privacy of your mail.
Interesting.
Government can't go through your mail to find out if there are condoms in it. Or maybe it's the pill. I think that's kind of the legal precedent. It depended a lot on the state. But yeah, I mean, in Europe, contraception was widespread before 1965.
Right.
So it's not the root cause of anything. I just think that these legal cases, even if they're kind of inevitable given social transformations, they further kind of nurture this process of decay.
Right. Well, I think it's just to add to this, because I think we're less debating now, and we're discussing this matter in a speculative fashion. I mean, the key thing is, again, separating sex from reproduction, and I obviously think that the sexual revolution, the cultural sexual revolution, went a long ways in that. What's fascinating going forward is that millennials and Gen Z are actually not having that much sex. We're kind of, at least I'm in my 40s. I'm used to the kind of, what's going wrong with kids these days? Why are there's teenage pregnancy, and these girls are sluts, etc. That's really a kind of outmoded issue. I think now what we're seeing is this almost like dissociation of gender from sexuality. So there's not a lot of sex going on, and there are a lot of causes for that. Porn, widely available porn being one of them, just being extremely online, which is made worse by COVID, all sorts of things. But that is happening. There's a culture of loneliness and being alone and having friends on Facebook, but not having friends in real life, and it's very sad. But I think what's happening within that context is almost this obsession with gender, but not necessarily sexuality. So you have millennials and Gen Z people who aren't having sex. They aren't, engaging in the kind of fantasy life of the sexual revolution, Woodstock or James Bond or Marilyn Monroe or whatever. But they're instead kind of exploring gender identity in these extreme ways. So they might very well be abstinent, but they have they as a pronoun, and they're exploring gender identity and so on. It's kind of like this gender dimorphism is kind of this like late stage of a decaying civilization, where not only have we kind of separated sex and reproduction, but we've now separated gender from sex.
Well, you're absolutely right on this concept. And I recently saw an article that described about the frustration between men between the ages of 18 and 30. These men, they may be somewhat unattractive. They have less of an educational background. They're being discluded because they choose to meet someone on a platform that it uses an algorithm that sets them in the lower standard based on their wealth and their education.
Well, I'm not sure I would blame the algorithm on that. I mean, maybe not entirely, but I think this move away from sexuality based on, say, location, in the sense of you are going to marry your high school sweetheart, or you're going to meet a girl at a bar or at the county fair or whatever, and moving towards online dating has had very important effects. But I mean, it's clear from just express preferences by people. There's an interesting racial component to express preferences. And basically, African American women and Asian men kind of get the short end of the stick. I believe Asian women are the most preferred by all races. Other women are more picky, so African American men effectively express no preference. Just if you're there and good looking, let's go. Women are much more picky. So I think in a way, these things like, OkCupid or Match.com or Tinder or whatever, they've kind of revealed preferences that I think a lot of people in our society thought that we had overcome, that class and class and race don't matter. Maybe even income doesn't matter anymore. Maybe even gender doesn't matter. But it's not true.
So basically what you're trying to say is we've got this all figured out. We're just doing it the wrong way.
No, I'm definitely not saying that. What do you mean?
Well,
Or I don't think I'm saying that. What do
why
you mean
can't
by
we
that?
just all be happy? Really?
Well, I mean that just is just a platitude.
Some people aren't happy unless they're marginalized, so they do the most to become marginalized, even altering their gender and forcing their ideals of life down others' throats.
You're absolutely right.
Unfortunately, I just wish we could go fall back on science. I mean, science hasn't lied to us about gender, and there was nothing wrong with it. The only people that had a problem with it were those who were then considered mentally ill. Now, because the new updated DSM has things like furries, they've forgotten all about the trans people. And it's clearly, I mean, suicide is a symptom of transgenderism. So how is that not a mental illness?
Okay, I would say here real quick, we need to tread a bit lightly, just as a matter of discretion.
Why do we have
just
to be
just to let you know that?
I saw a post. I saw a post today. I believe it was National Girl Day or something like that, and I supported that. I'm all for girl power. Women can rule this world with a man standing behind them. Okay, all about girls. Okay, and
how did you end up in this space? I'm curious.
I said girl power. Every woman was once a girl. And I posted that. And then oh shit, I got to thinking about it. Well, nowadays, not every woman was a girl. So I had to delete my post so I could be politically correct.
Well, I think maybe bringing things back to the discussion of sort of matriarchal or patriarchal society, I think maybe we can consider the transgender phenomenon as maybe part of that shift towards a matriarchal society, that maybe on a subconscious level, these men are usually not very popular, maybe not successful socially or in their career, and so they realize that it would maybe be advantageous to become a woman, and it would make it easier to participate in society. I don't know. Maybe that's
I do believe it's a trend. I mean, just like the saggy pants thing with white boys and dressing like they were rappers. It's a trend.
Really?
One day it'll be long gone, and the people who changed their bodies and altered themselves to fit this trend, they're going to look like monsters to everyone else. That's just how I feel.
But not if it goes from a trend to a solidified thing. Like if we become a society where it's mostly women who are educated and are in professional roles, and men sort of do I don't know, low skilled labor or whatever, then it will become something to aspire to, which is I think maybe on some level happening with these men who are transitioning to becoming female.
I think it's also why a lot of women are becoming lesbian, is because women are trying to form strong bonds with weak men, and that's a huge problem.
You're absolutely right. And that is the problem. There is this downfall, this corruption of the pyramid. Men have been at the top of the pyramid forever. There's no good men out there. We need to do our jobs. We need to take care of our children. We need to treat our women like they deserve to be treated. If they're not performing well, they don't get treated well.
I think it's just a bit deeper than that. I mean, I get it, but All right, let's move on. Let's just get some questions.
Can I say one more thing? I think that a big problem is that there's a lot of fatherless homes, and so young men don't learn the things that they used to learn about, like treating a woman like a lady and like walking on the right side of the street, stuff like that. It's a dumb.
Jesus Christ, man. Chivalry's dead, man.
That's what I'm saying. It shouldn't be, though. I wish it wouldn't. I wish it would come back with a vengeance.
But if they had fathers, would they learn that anyway? Because who would their fathers be?
Yeah, true.
But you are aware of this situation, and you brought the point up so that you can do something. You can make a change.
I'm trying.
Okay.
Trying as well.
So, Bardam, do you want to jump in and ask a question for Kleutgen or myself?
Yes, I have a question to Kleutgen. And he was talking about COVID earlier and how we think it's exaggerated. But I have noticed something that the same people who say that it's sort of exaggerated and that you shouldn't take any measures, they get really upset when hospitals deny people treatment or put the people down on the donations list because they don't wear a mask or have vaccinations, because it sort of ties into this whether life is worth preserving at all ends. Because if you don't in the sort of like abortion debate, because how should I put this? I'm sorry.
No, I think you made that. You're making an interesting point. I mean, I think COVID is so polarized. I do think it comes from a certain worldview on some level, but I think on another level, polarization, itself is so strong that everything almost has to pick a side. Movies get polarized, music gets polarized, etc. But I think you're getting at, like, there are very strong inner contradictions to both sides, and if we just focus on the right, the notion that we're exaggerating this pandemic and it doesn't really matter, it's just the flu or whatever they're saying, and then when it was brought up that maybe we should actually treat the vaccinated patients before we treat the unvaccinated, is cries of medical apartheid. You're discriminating against a group of people, the unvaccinated, etc. I agree that it's like we're trapped in like only liberal arguments, and you just see these pretty obvious contradictions come to the fore almost immediately.
Which is why their first response to that was, well, what about obese people? What about smokers? We should take care of everybody, which again is grounded in liberalism.
Exactly. And that's what we need to get out of. I mean, again, like, everything is a limited resource. And, what is the statistic? 60 to 80% of all medical expenses happen in the last 3 months of life or something like that. I mean, I might be a little bit off in the numbers, but I don't think I'm exaggerating anything. What is that but the fact that we don't have a proper relationship towards death, and that we are clinging to life desperately. Now, Kleutgen might say that is because we don't have a proper relationship to the afterlife, but we love life too much. We're terrified. There's nothing beyond being a consumer of widgets, etc.
Are these witches liberals or Democrats?
Widgets is what I said, not witches.
Sorry.
But to answer your question directly, they're demon rats.
Yeah. Okay. I got a good question for you.
This is a Flashman chat, by the way.
Okay, let's do one more. I'm actually getting kind of hungry. I'm going to need to eat a late dinner at some point, and I know it's fairly late. Let's take one last question from someone who hasn't spoken. Whoa! I'm going to the person with the huge cleavage. Who's that? Adam? Oh, we can't fit you in. Okay. What about W? Who is that? Oh, that's requested. What about Obvious? Have you spoken yet?
Yeah, I've got a good one for you, mate. Just in regards to that obvious self-obsession, you don't have a place in society. People can't accept death because to them, themselves is everything they have. Maybe their family a little bit, but they can't conceptualize anything. Does that tie into abortion thing, the motivations? Because obviously women are undergoing the same thing, and they see a pregnancy early on in their life as it destroys their ability to make money. Basically, it's the family life isn't there anymore. Society's pretty anti-natal. So it's just a generalised question. I don't know how you go about answering that, but yeah.
A little bit too generalized. I think we are just going to put a bookmark in it. I am actually just simply getting hungry. So I am sorry that we haven't answered everyone's questions, but this was an excellent discussion. And I will definitely, Kleutgen, I'll definitely take you up on your offer to discuss Apolloism once we are ready to go. We might do some little discussion before that, in fact. But yeah, thank you to everyone. We had a very good audience, 100 to 200 people listening live. Have recorded this. I will post this in the next few days. I know I've been kind of bad about posting things, but I will get better. Thanks for all the listeners, and I appreciate it. And thanks to Josh for being an excellent moderator. And I will see you guys soon. All right.
Yeah,
bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'd like to participate again.